Hello, and welcome to the Digital Workspace Works podcast. I'm Ryan Purvis, your host, supported by our producer Heather Bicknell. In this series, you'll hear stories and opinions from experts in the field, stories from the front lines, the problems they face and how they solved them, the areas they focused on from technology, people and processes, to the approaches they took that will help you to get to the grips with the digital workspace inner workings.
So I had this epiphany this morning while I was working out. I think I finally figured out Microsoft's strategy, the operating system.
Okay.
So I think they deliberately are splitting out the operating system into two flavors. Maybe more, but definitely, I definitely see Windows 10 as we know it as the enterprise version going down the route of being a non-persistent operating system. So what do I mean by that? I mean that it's something that'll be a baked image that you'll release either on your WVD platform or your own VDI platform on very common architecture that you can completely control either in the WVD world or in your own data center. But it's meant to run on very specific hardware that you control all the variables in that ecosystem. And then you have this flavor, which is where they're going the route for the dual screen device, however the thing's called. They've got another Windows flavor called R or X or something that's coming, which is like a pared down version. I think that's the version that's going to be more consumer oriented, which will work on more variable devices. But because they've used Android for their new flip phone device, it almost looks like they're moving slightly less, moving out of the consumer space and relying more on a operating system that is strong in the consumer space. And you may even see Windows fall away at that level. Not in the next 2 years, but I could see it happening over time. And then in that space, you'll be using apps more to access Microsoft products or Azure services, because at that point, who cares about the Windows, the operating system for the consumer? Because it's going to be replaced by Android or iOS. It doesn't matter, or Linux distro. That's what I was thinking this morning. I think that's quite a play if that's what they're doing.
Is it Windows S that's the lightweight one, or I don't know if they.
Yeah, so Windows
different names.
Windows S is the it's got a like it's locked down to the point that you can't use any other browsers. You can only use at that point it was Edge. Now it's the new version of Edge at least.
Yeah.
But there's another one that they've been working on. I heard it the other day, which is another sort of spin-off version. Which I think is going to be the consumer-oriented one, and then you're going to have the proper Windows 10, the big one, will be meant for more VDI environments, with this rapid, evergreen replacing of rebuilds often and rolling out new patches often, and the sort of rapid cycle of enhancements. I think that's their plan.
Did you read something that sparked you in this direction, or was it just observations from years?
Well, like most of these sorts of things, they just pop up in your head sometimes. You just, I listen to Windows Weekly as my main sort of Windows podcast. I've got other Azure ones and that stuff, but they were saying something. Well, we've talked about on the show as well about how. I really hate Windows 10 as a consumer operating system, and I think it's only designed for where we're going in the sense of a hosted desktop as a service offering. But if you take it away from every user, then you don't have, or if you move it out of the end user space, then you lose a huge amount of your market share and your sort of cult of Microsoft following, because everyone just uses Windows because that's what's the most proliferate device. And I don't think you want to, as a strategy, you don't ever want Microsoft to be known as only an enterprise operating system. I think that would kill your business. As much as they don't really focus on Windows in their earnings calls and that kind of stuff. But the more I've thought about it, and the more I've seen how they're rolling out updates and how unstable things are, the more I've thought that that's probably what they are trying to do, but they have to put something on the consumer side. So you have the Windows 10S, but there's another one, which I think is called X. I think that's still coming out, which is almost designed for consumer. And I think that's the one that, because if you break them apart, this is where the sort of the epiphany came from. If you break them apart and you have the Windows 10 Enterprise Edition that is designed for VDI infrastructures that can be rolled out regularly, and you take away all that headache from the internal IT guys trying to keep up to date with the new releases. But you now provide it in such a way that they can roll out the images quite quickly as well, because your other pattern is you're trying to keep the consumer happy, rolling out these big updates to the consumer. Most consumers don't need the new functionality often. They just need the security updates. So you need to make the operating system a lot more lightweight, and I say light in relative terms, or less complicated for a user to upgrade by themselves, because that's what the challenge is right now. If sitting through this pandemic and having people working remotely and they're having issues with updates, it's very frustrating because it's a really poor experience, and it's an experience you can't control. And most of the problems are because you've got encrypted drives, which the average consumer won't do. They're not going to install BitLocker, and they're not going to, or whatever you use. They're just going to run their machines, which they shouldn't, to be honest. They should be encrypting their drives, but typically they won't. But if you go down the enterprise route, where most businesses are now, and I say most, I mean, I haven't got a number for this, but I know the banks have all gone VDI to some extent, and the other businesses are following through with it. And also, it makes sense now if Microsoft's offering you an Azure service that you can pay for as part of your E5 license or your E3 license or whatever it is, which is cheaper than having laptops, and you can secure your data, because that's really what you're paying. What you want is you want to secure your data, you want to have stable environment. It becomes a really nice story to say, well, just pay it on your corporate card to have the machine for a month, or put it on your Azure your invoice to run your infrastructure. We don't have to go buy 1,000 laptops, 10,000 laptops, whatever it is. Everyone can just use their device of choice, which is connected into a secure environment. So yeah, I think it's just puzzle pieces fitting together, just in this thing of going, well, actually that would probably be what they're trying to get to. Was what I would do if I were in there, if I was in such as shoes, pushing the strings.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that with, obviously they want to move people to WVD and onto Azure. That's sort of the play. So really anything that gets people to Azure is the move they're making right now, especially in the enterprise.
Yeah, and you've got to look at it from a what is the ideal end game for them? If they are trying to, if you're trying to manage both ecosystems, because the consumer ecosystem is very different to the enterprise ecosystem. I mean, average consumer, if they're down for a couple of days, they're only going to complain about it to someone, and they go on social media, but they'll get it resolved, whatever. But if you bring down a whole business because you've rolled out a new patch like 20.14, which was a nightmare to upgrade to, that's going to affect your commercial deal with the business. So who's going to shout the loudest? Well, obviously someone that's got a lot of seats. So just like I say, the epiphany just makes sense to me. We'll see what happens. Sort of one of those things. Let's see where we are in 5 years' time.
Yeah, watch this space. So how is your personal Linux journey going? Are you still playing around with that?
I am. I've actually been playing around with it today a little bit here and there. I'm finding a few challenges. It's not as easy as I hoped it would be. And I think that's just the reality of moving to a different ecosystem. A lot of the apps that I use daily don't exist in the Linux system, which is very frustrating. So as going to a vanilla distribution doesn't work off the bat, because they're not as popular as Windows 10 or the Mac OS. So what I am seeing is that most of the apps that I want are on Mac. So I've been rebuilding my Mac laptop that I gave my wife a while ago to be maybe my device that I move to for general things. And then I'm basically going to work between my iPad and the Mac, and then that should get me off completely. And it's little things like Notion, which I use for everything, that doesn't have a Linux app. OneDrive doesn't have a Linux app. The Dropbox that I use sometimes also doesn't have a Linux app. So there's a lot of unofficial apps. So I'm trying those things out. If they work, then I'll try it out just for a period of time. I think the world is moving to a more Linux environment. If you look at it generally speaking, all your IoT devices are built on a Linux environment. A lot of applications for years have been hosted on Linux. Linux has always been the most stable thing. And the actual, general UX experience on a Linux device is actually better than Windows 10, if I'm honest. It's a lot simpler, a lot cleaner, but it does miss a couple things. Like there's no, like Windows, you press the Windows key and you get the search thing. You can just search for something and use it. I haven't found that on Linux per se. You've got to kind of tweak it a little bit. So I think it's a little bit of a hobby horse, but it's not far away. What I'm finding interesting, and this is also based on discussion with Jed, is the performance difference is crazy. I mean, the machine that I've set up for Linux, the battery life is double what it was on 10, and 0 to boot. It's as good as a Mac in the sense you just open it up and you're there. The Windows device is still 3-4 seconds sometimes. You still got to press a few buttons to get in, because it's just not that user experience you're looking for. So we'll see. I'm trying very hard to move. The other problem is I don't always have the time to go and do the research. And things like, the other thing that I struggled with the other day is I wanted to do a whole bunch of pivot table stuff in Excel. And I just wasn't confident that LibreOffice could do it.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like, can you do that kind of stuff?
Yeah, Excel is one of those apps that's really hard to replace with anything else.
Yeah.
You need it for that. Anything really other than being simple tables. It's like, I can't really use Sheets or something else.
Exactly. So the other thing that I wanted to chat to you about is I've been rereading 2 books. One was called The Goal. The other one is called The Lean Startup. And both of them are quite interesting. Specifically where I am with one of my projects at the moment is around how you organize when you're building something. And the goal is about it's a concept of the theory of constraints, which means you can only, if you think about it, and the example that and it's a book worth reading because it's a very good story the way it's written. It takes you through the factory process of building widgets. They've got obviously product or whatever it is. But the problem with the book is it doesn't really cross the line into software development, which is where I was kind of trying to get my head around. So you read the story and you're like, okay, that's great. I understand theory of constraints and what you're trying to do. And the sort of there's this couple concepts, but the one concept is how you order things, and it goes contrary to what you think is a logical assumption. So, for example, ordering things, you order it by the slowest thing first, because the slowest thing needs to be done first before you can do all the quicker things, and it kind of speeds you up. The other thing, which is around batch sizing, how much work do you do to get something out? Do you do things one to the end, or single item finished first, and then you do the next one, or do you do maybe an example would be filling envelopes? Do you fill all the envelopes to the same point, and then you write the address, and then you seal them, or do you finish one envelope and then do the next envelope, And it's these sort of they're contradictions in terms, because some people say, well, if you fill all the envelopes together, you're obviously quicker because you're doing the simple tasks you're doing all the filling at the same time, you're doing all the labeling at the same time, you're doing all the sticking at the same time. But your problem is, if you find a problem at the end of the process, you've now got to go and unfill all the envelopes that you filled up. So it's those sorts of contradictory terms you've got to get your head around. So that's where the two books combine and be quite nice, because Lean Startup talks a lot about experimentation and getting the metrics right. The Goal talks about the metrics, and it talks about getting these other concepts, ordering things and batch sizing. But the Lean Startup kind of crosses the bridge into software development or building product, which is where I'm at the moment. So yeah, both really good books, really good ones to read. If you're looking for something to read.
Well, it sounds interesting. So they both sort of more theory based than like the author's personal experience.
Yeah. So the Goal is theoretical. He's trying to convey the concept. Whereas the Lean Startup is actually a combination of both. So the guy who writes the Lean Startup, Eric Rice, he talks about one of the startups that he worked in and what they had to deal with. And then he also looks at other examples. So his product, what they did and where they did well or badly, and then he'll look at an example wherever else, and it'll be whoever it is. So things like the envelope example is a good one, where he's explaining how the envelope thing is. You'd think people would say that the productivity gain would be that you're doing the same task in repeat and repetition, but actually the benefit you get from doing one revolution complete, which is to pick the envelope, fill the envelope, and write the label on it, is better because you identify problems quicker. You get the results quicker as well, which means you can push it out. So you can, if you're thinking about doing a big mailing out to 1,000 people, the minute that envelope's ready, you can send it out. Whereas if you're doing it batching and you're trying to do what everyone would think is a logical way of batching, where you fill them all together, then you label them all together, you stick them, then you send them, you have to wait till 1,000 are finished before you send them out. Mm-hmm. Now, if you were to be posting out, let's say you finish 10 envelopes a day, and you start sending out, the next day, 10 out of a row, you may realize that after 50 that actually the project's finished. So you stop. So your cost is cut off at that point. But if you did 1,000 and then you sent them out, well, you're committed now. You've already spent the time, the resource, the money. And if you have to pull the plug, then you can't undo that. So that's the sort of thing. That's where I am in the book now. I'm about 60% through, but that's much more practical, which is probably why I'm enjoying it a bit more, because whilst the Goal is written really well, and it's written as a story in the day in the life of a plant manager, and he's also going to go through this exercise of re-educating people against some fallacies, like if you're in a factory, the machines always should be working. And if they're not doing what's a priority item, they should just be doing what they do. So, building surplus, building inventory of parts. And he's actually saying, well, no, that's a waste, because you not only do you waste the time building the machine, building the inventory, but that inventory sits on the floor and it costs you money while it sits there. And it costs you space, and because every time you try to navigate the factory floor, you've got to navigate all this extra surplus of stuff you don't need. So it's again coming back to this concept of build the most important thing end to end first, and then build the next most important thing end to end first, and don't split your resources and make everyone focus. And that correlates quite nicely into a dev team, where you're saying we've got a dev team of 1, 2, 3, 5 people, whatever it is, but they need to work on that component, the most important component first, get that finished, and then do the next one, and get that finished, and then get the next one, instead of having teams that are spread out doing too many things. And you're trying to bring them back together later on, because they'll always be out of sequence. And it's all about getting that sequencing right.
Yeah. No, that makes sense to me. That is interesting, because I think, it is kind of unintuitive versus the way of, I'm just thinking about even the assembly line, which I guess sort of combines both envelope approaches to some extent, because you have the machine or the person doing the repeat task, which has that efficiency of, being designed for that, or being accustomed to whatever part in the process they're doing. But then you are getting, complete items one at a time, not, building pieces and then finishing them all at once. It's not like you have a team of 5 who are responsible for building cars end to end, and you replicate that team across the floor. You have that whole chain that goes down. So.
Yeah, and it does work. I mean, if you think about it from the technology world, that's often where teams get hurt because they're trying to do too many things at once. And I know we're all guilty of it. I mean, I'm sitting with it now, and we have split the team to work on two different pieces of functionality. But the reality is that whilst it's a conscious decision, is those two pieces are completely distinct from each other. So they have to be finished. They're finished. And we try to reduce it, because that's the other thing, you reduce the dependencies as much as possible, and at least be aware of what your dependencies are. So, for example, typical resource that's a specialist skill would be a graphic designer. The graphic designer can only work on one component at a time. So you need to know which one, he or she needs to work on first, so they can set that piece up before the developer starts, or be aware that the developer's going to get to a point where they're going to need the graphic designer. And then you're sort of trying to find the right balance to say, well, when does the graphic designer get involved versus with one component versus the other, so that you can still have the same end date, which sometimes gets forgotten because you don't sometimes think of those dependencies. What happens usually is that developers work on something, they both get to the same point, and then they say, oh, now we need a graphic designer, and the graphic designer goes, oh, well, which one do I work on first? So yeah, it's so interesting because it's good to read books a few times, because sometimes you read the book and it's just interesting to read at the time, but you don't really apply it. And sometimes you read and you're like, holy crap, this is exactly what I'm dealing with. And I'm so glad I'm reading this book because it's giving me ideas. And it talks about things in the lean startup like A/B testing, rolling out functionality, but also what I'm really finding interesting is the metrics. Because there's vanity metrics. And vanity metrics, look at a podcast, for example. How many downloads do you have? Well, it's nice to know that you had a good month, that you had, 100 episodes downloaded. That's great. But does that really tell you anything about your podcast? Well, no, nothing. It doesn't tell you anything. What's a much more interesting thing to know, and we don't unfortunately get those stats, is does someone listen all the way through? Do they listen? Are they subscribed or not? We don't get, we don't know how many subscribers are. We just see that we've got a whole lot of downloads. But that's the important stuff that you want. And then you can start working on ways to make it more sticky. So things like potentially running a survey at some point and asking, when someone listens to the episode, click on this, answer the survey. Why did you listen? What made it interesting? Was it the title? Was it because we interviewed a guest? Was it because it's a topic that's important to you right now? Those sorts of little bits of extra information will help us, improve the quality of the product, which is the episode.
Yeah, we can look at through Spotify and Apple Podcasts actually the listen through time to see when people drop.
But see, I only really look at what Transistor gives us. I don't really look at that.
Do they not have that?
No, I haven't seen it.
Strange. Yeah, I mean that's a nice aggregated metric because
I mean, for me, I'm looking at more, the reason why I look at the downloads is just to make sure the episode's getting out. But after that, it's just nice to see the numbers going up.
Right.
But it's more when you get someone that you speak to that sends you a message or you chat to in a call and go, oh, yeah, I listened to your episode on whatever it was, gamification or information security or stuff. I really enjoyed that. It would be great to hear more about what you think on this stuff. So that's the difference, I guess, in some senses.
Yeah, I'm at time too. So.
We'll chat on Thursday.
Yeah, sounds good.
Have a good day.
All
right. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Heather Bicknell is our producer and editor. Thank you, Heather, for your hard work on this episode. Please subscribe to the series and rate us on iTunes or the Google Play Store. Follow us on Twitter @the DWW Podcast. The show notes and transcripts will be available on the website www.digitalworkspace.works. Please also visit our website www.digitalworkspace.works and subscribe to our newsletter. And lastly, if you found this episode useful, please share with your friends or colleagues.